There are 4 universes. Below them is the physical world, consisting of the elements. The elements and their spiritual counterparts are divided, just like the 10 sephirot, or the channels of divine energy. In each universe there is an inner light. Outside of this light is the light of the quarry of souls, and outside that, the light of the quarry of angels. Outside of these is the darkening light, the quarry of the husks. Finally, outside them all is the universe itself. The thought of the prophet is divested from his body and ascends upward from level to level until it reaches the place where the root of his soul is attached to the sephirot. He then concentrates to elevate the light of the sephirot to the infinite being, and from there to transmit light to the sephirot again. The prophet must make use of meditations and unifications given over to him by the master prophet, who teaches him the methods of prophecy. Through such unifications, one can transmit light and influx as one desires. The master prophets also taught another discipline. This consisted of prayers and the utterance of divine names, whispered to the angels who guard the gates of the firmaments and the chambers of each universe. Through these, the prophets ascend through each of the 4 universes and through the space between them until they reach the highest. At first they would work to open the gates of a particular level. Then they would meditate on the unification and recite the particular prayer appropriate to that level. In this manner, they would ascend from level to level until they reached their highest root, and there they would stand. Then they would transmit their thoughts up to the infinite being, and finally, they would return, transmitting the influx down below. Good afternoon. The program is Spirit, Mind, Body. We've reversed the order of that because a woman who has a program called Body, Mind, Spirit has been calling our manager and complaining that we stole the title of her show. Well, it was inadvertent, and if she's listening, please accept our apologies. And it enables us to put those 3 words in their more proper order: spirit, mind, body, because that's the way it crystallizes. It begins as pure spirit, then crystallizes in interior levels as mind and body. But again, as we always say, that there's no and between these words. Spirit, mind, body is one unified experience and existence. And this is what we try to do every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at this time, is to unveil a little bit the mystery of spirit, mind, body, the mystery of being human. Because there are ethical responsibilities of being human, there are various kinds of delights and enjoyments of being human, but there's also the mystery of being human. And we don't separate that off someplace in a corner to call it mysticism, but we feel that that also should be integrated with our whole human experience. And we think that the 1980s is a time where this integration of the mystery of being human is going to become key to even the material survival of cultures. That if we don't somehow reintegrate our native sense of the sacred, that the whole human enterprise is just going to become more and more abstract, and it's going to crumble under its own abstractions and dehumanizations. So we have with us today in the studio Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, and as you might have noticed, I was reading a text from the Kabbalah, which appears in his book called Meditation in the Bible. and we're going to be talking about the Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism this afternoon. Rabbi Kaplan has written a lot of books. Some of you may be familiar with a widely circulated book in Jewish bookstores called Handbook of Jewish Thought. Recently, he's gone he's published a couple of books from Samuel Weiser's here in New York. I'm sure many of you know the bookstore down on Broadway and 8th Street, and they also are a publishing company. And that's who published this recent book, Meditation in the Bible, which I've just read, and which I just read from. And just a few weeks ago or so, the Bahir came out, which is a mystical text that predates the Zohar. Did you say?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and he went particularly to Weiser's because I think he felt that the Jewish bookstores will pick these books up anyway, but here's a chance of getting this material out to the secular world, which include, of course, Jews and non-Jews, anyone interested in the practice of meditation or in the mystery of being human, as I put it. And I will say that reading his book, Meditation in the Bible, although I've been studying and practicing meditation for quite a few years, I learned more, and there's a kind of special fragrance and resonance about the way he goes about it. He goes into the kind of verbal archaeology, as he calls it, into the roots of the Hebrew words, and he quotes a great deal from the sources of Jewish mystical tradition, which exists pretty much entirely in Hebrew, and so a lot of the material here is translated for the first time into English. So it's a really good book, and Aryeh, maybe we can just talk about some of the themes in the book. Where it's a vast subject. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think perhaps the main part of the main subject of the book is Jewish meditation in general, and one of the reasons that I wrote the book was because so many people have no idea that such an animal as Jewish meditation even exists, which is why that I wrote the book in the particular way I did, not so much as my book, but mostly to a large degree citing sources, ancient and not so ancient, which discuss Jewish meditation.
Let me begin autobiographically. But you mentioned that you got interested in Kabbalah sort of indirectly when you were writing the Handbook of Jewish Thought. You realized that you couldn't leave out Kabbalah, and that you sort of had to understand it, and that was sort of the way you got into the study of it.
Right. That if you look at Jewish thought, of course, the Handbook I consider my most important work, the most important thing I've ever done. I wrote most of it about 12 years ago, or more already. And when I was doing it, I gradually realized that for the past 500 years, the dominant force in Jewish thought has been Kabbalah. Of course, you have Halacha, you have Talmud, you have many other things, but I'm saying as far as original thought, as far as philosophy is concerned, like Jewish philosophy comes to almost an abrupt end in the 14th or 15th centuries. And from there on, all of Jewish philosophy and all of Jewish thought and theology is totally dominated by Kabbalah.
Now, for non-Jews listening, Kabbalah is is the way of referring to Jewish mysticism in general. Would you say?
Kabbalah means taking or acceptance. And usually means the tradition.
It's receiving something from maybe a spiritual master.
It's the tradition with a capital T. Mm-hmm. That's really what Kabbalah means.
And we don't want to go into great discussion about this, but as Aryeh Kaplan reminded me to remind you that he is not just a Kabbalist. I mean, he's an Orthodox Jew, and in the rich soil of Orthodoxy is where these beautiful flowers of the Kabbalah grow. I mean, they don't grow in thin air. But we're going to concentrate the program today, entirely, if we can, on the Kabbalah, and later in the program he's going to suggest and lead us through a couple of forms of meditation.
Mm-hmm. And we might discuss some other forms.
Right. So you ran into Kabbalah in this sort of indirect way, but then you told me earlier that you've been meditating ever since you were a boy, but not really realizing what was going on.
Let me just elaborate on that. That as anybody who's familiar at all with the Jewish community knows, the Orthodox Jew prays 3 times a day. And the center part of that prayer is a prayer known as the Amidah, or informally known as the Shemona Esrei. And a person says that prayer with intense concentration. And if one does it correct as prescribed in the Code of Jewish Law, one actually is doing a meditation. One is gently pushing away all outside thoughts. One is pulling oneself close to the divine. One is drawing close to the divine in it. One is really, if one is saying the Shemona Esrei or the Amidah correctly, one is attaching himself to the divine. And as we never thought of it as meditation, even though I might add that the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, when it speaks about the Amidah, uses the Hebrew word for meditation, hitbodedut, which is a part of the vocabulary that's not that well known, is how to translate it correctly. But I find, and very often people come to me and ask me, I'm Jewish, I want to meditate, I'm a religious Jew, I pray every day, how should I meditate? I say, make your daily prayer into a meditation. That itself, instead, there are other meditations a person could do, but the major meditation that a Jew does it can be part of the service. And I might want to mention that this whole methodology was part of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings in Hasidism. That although many other schools of Jewish meditation had existed, what the Baal Shem Tov did was make the normal prayer service the integral part of Jewish meditation.
And this can be applied, of course, to other traditions. People who grow up in other traditions and see them just on the surface, they can rediscover the meditative value in them, and that's one of the functions I think that Jewish mysticism is going to have in the new culture. It's not that everybody is going to become Jewish or something like that, but that for a non-Jew, for instance, to familiarize themselves with Jewish mysticism will allow them to look into their traditions, whether it's Islamic or Christian or whatever they're raised in, and see the richness, the mystical richness that's sort of just underneath the surface there.
Well, so, I might add that in Kabbalah, one of the important teachings is really, and especially if you look in the Lurianic writings, what happens is that every act that a person does throughout the day can and does become a meditation. And this was the yichud, the unifications, actually, that you mentioned in your reading, that with every act that a person does in the course of the day, one can create a unification.
And I like the word unification better than attaching oneself to God or binding oneself to God. That phrase. I like the idea of unifying oneself with God because it's a more intimate thing. It shows that the essence of the mystical path in all the traditions, which is a kind of forgetting oneself in the divine, is also functioning in Jewish mysticism. There's a point in the I-thou relationship where one forgets that there's any separation at all between the I and the thou.
There is nothing but thee.
Nothing but thee. So the fact remains, though, that if you had never gotten into Kabbalah, and if your awareness hadn't been sensitized by reading these great masters of Kabbalah, you might never really have recognized Jewish practice as meditation.
Yeah, I would have been meditating, but not applying the word to it.
But more than just a word, you wouldn't have been applying a whole attitude to it. I mean, it's a.
I think that's true. Very often, of course, the great danger in any religious tradition is that what one does becomes rote and habit. And in a meditative sense, the more rote a person becomes, the deeper it becomes. The more often something is repeated. So it's really a totally different way of looking at the same thing.
Yeah. So in a way, you talked about Kabbalah as the tradition with a capital T. In that sense, you're an initiate of that tradition, and primarily, at least initially, was through reading. I mean, through as I understand it, you didn't study with some Kabbalist master at first.
I did have masters,
but later.
Yes. Well, both.
Both.
I mean, I wouldn't mention their names, but
that's good.
I was close to a number of very
So
great
it's
Kabbalists.
available. In other words, it's available in the world today. It's not a lost tradition.
By no means. By no means.
And so, particularly Jews who have karmically a more direct access to their tradition, but also non-Jews who are drawn should know that Kabbalah is a real living thing, and we can have access to it. And in fact, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who we're talking with this morning, himself teaches classes in Brooklyn. And later we'll mention where you can get a hold of him in case you'd like to come to one of those classes. But I think it's, there were times when people thought that Kabbalah was just some sort of museum piece, that maybe didn't exist anymore, except a few books. And it's really wonderful to know that it's alive and well, and in fact that it's spreading out, that you're going to Weisers, for instance, to publish your books now, and instead of just to Jewish publishers. And there's a kind of
Kabbalah is a very powerful source. I just want to pick up on something you said when I said Kabbalah is the tradition. Another thesis that I try to bring forth in my book Meditation in the Bible is that Kabbalah is not something that sort of attach itself to Judaism somewhere along the line, but if one actually studies the Bible very carefully, one can find the root, or very often very expressly, all of Kabbalistic traditions right there in the Bible itself.
Let's begin with the word, the Hebrew word for meditation. That you've identified and focused on. And can you explain the inner meanings of that word, and why translators, even Hebrew scholars, have overlooked the fact that it really means meditation?
Yes, I think that might be one of the key points. The word for meditation is hitbodedut, which literally means self-isolation. And if you look in most translations, even of texts, important meditative texts, they just translate as isolation. You don't get any idea that they're talking about meditation. The first clue I saw to it was in a text by Maimonides' son, where he speaks about isolation, and he says there's two types of self-isolation, two types of hitbodedut. There's external isolation and internal isolation. And using that word, he says, like, external isolation is what everybody takes for granted. You go into caves, into forests, into deserts, and you try to be alone with the divine. Internal isolation, he says, is meditation, where one isolates one's mind from all thought and from all sensation. So the word hitbodedut means isolation, but it means isolation more in the meditative sense than the physical sense. And then throughout the literature, as you explore a context in which this word is used, you find that this is the context in which it is used. Not secluding oneself, but secluding oneself mentally, secluding oneself from this world, so to speak, and opening yourself to the spiritual worlds.
You go into, for instance, Ezekiel's vision in the Bible in some detail, because this is a rare instance in which a prophet spoke a little detail about their method of experience and the actual form of the experience. Can you illustrate what you've said about meditation in terms of that vision, say of Ezekiel's vision?
Ezekiel's vision. It's interesting that even the Talmud mentions that Ezekiel was one of the last prophets. And according to the Talmud, Ezekiel's experience was that experienced by every prophet, except that being among the last prophets, Ezekiel was the only one to bother to explain it. Actually, if you look at Ezekiel's vision, one of the most important parts of it is at the very beginning. It says he saw a stormy wind coming from the north, a dark cloud, flashing fire. And the Zohar explains this, that these were the different mental states that he experienced. First, when you first start meditating, you feel all the storminess within yourself, all the conflicts and all the problems you have come to the surface. This is the stormy wind. Then, everything blanks out. And you're like in a dark cloud, a deep cloud, Ezekiel's deep cloud. And you feel that there's no place to go. You're lost. Next, you start seeing the light. But you can't take it. It's like a fire. If you're not prepared, it'll burn you. And then you see the noga, the glow, out of the dark. The fire, by the way, I might mention, it's not mentioned in the book. According to the Kabbalists, the fire is a black fire, not a white fire. It's like a glowing blackness.
The inside of the sun is black. That's what sunspots are. Is gaps in the surface of the sun.
Just a black fire. In fact, there's a famous midrash that says the Torah was written with white fire on black fire. So the first thing you see is the black fire. Which is the cloud is like you see nothing, but this nothing becomes so intense it becomes like a burning nothingness, a black fire. Then out of it comes the glow, the noga, and it is from here that the vision starts coming forth. And of course, Ezekiel, you mentioned the four worlds. Ezekiel, of course, saw the four worlds, and they're all mentioned in it. Actually, the source of the four worlds is Ezekiel's vision. First, he sees the living creatures, which is the world of Yetzirah. Then he sees the wheels beneath them, which is Asiyah. Then he sees the throne, which is the third universe, and the man on the throne is finally the highest universe, the universe of the Sphirot, which you mentioned.
Which are the channels of the divine energy. They're not the divine itself yet. I mean, the man on the throne is by no means
the man on the throne is really the self you see when you are enlightened. According to the Kabbalists, the face on the man the face of the man on the throne is your own face.
And then out of that that light that you mentioned in Ezekiel's vision, then comes this silent voice. Or can you explain?
Chashmal, a very mystical word, chashmal, that Ezekiel speaks about, which is translated everything from electrum. In fact, in modern Hebrew, it became the word for electricity, even though it has absolutely no relationship at all to electricity. Chashmal, the Talmud explains what chashmal is. Chashmal is seen as the Talmud explains as the speaking silence. In other words, one gains a total inner silence, and one is able to listen then, and one hears. In fact, if what people usually ignore in Ezekiel's vision is the very ending of Ezekiel's vision, because all of Ezekiel's vision is seen as an introduction to where he hears the word. I mean, listening is probably the most important element in Judaism. In fact, the creed of the Jew begins, listen, hear, O Israel. They were told that we have to listen, to open up our minds and our hearts and hear the truth, open ourselves to the truth.
And it was the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th of the month, while I was among the exiles on the river Chebar, and the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. I saw and beheld a stormy wind come from the north, a great cloud and flashing fire, and a glow round about, and from its midst a vision of the speaking silence in the midst of the fire. Above the firmament, like a vision of sapphire, was the form of a throne. And over the form of the throne, there was a form like the vision of a man. On it from above. And I saw a vision of the speaking silence, like a vision of fire, as a house for it round about. From the vision of his thighs and above, and from the vision of his thighs and below, I saw a vision like fire with a glow around it. Like a vision of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the vision of the glow around. This was the vision of God's glory. I saw it, and I fell on my face. Then I heard a voice speak. It said to me, "Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you." Then a spirit came in me, and it spoke to me. It stood me on my feet, and I heard that which spoke to me.